This is the story of a couple that vows to stick together through thin and thick. However, their family goes through an immense tragedy, and as both of them die, one ends up in hell and the other in heaven. Let's see how they reunite again. Welcome to Movie Recall. In today's video, we will be going through the 1998 fantasy romance film, What Dreams May Come. It's time to recall. Let's get started, turn on subtitles, and spoilers ahead. The story starts with a pediatrician named Chris Neilson vacationing in Switzerland, and there he meets an artist named Annie. They meet when their boats bump into each other. They get to talk and hit it off as they have similar personalities. They go for a picnic together and Annie shares her sandwiches with Chris. They fall in love and get married and go on to have 2 kids. They have a wonderful life together. The children are now teenagers. The tragedy of the family starts with the death of both of their teenage kids when the bus that was taking them to school crashes. 4 years have gone by and Chris is at the hospital when he receives a call from his wife, who is stressed because the art pieces she acquired for a gallery opening have not arrived. She is worried because today is their anniversary and she does not want to ruin it by getting late, as she senses that she could get stuck at work. Chris also loves paintings, so he has ideas on how she could use them to replace the missing ones and promises his wife that he will drop off the real ones after work. When he is getting back in the evening, it is raining heavily and a car crashes in front of his car. He does not get hit, but being the responsible doctor that he is, he gets out of the car and approaches the victims in the crashed car. As he gets to the car, another car approaches and crashes, killing Chris right there. After a few seconds, Chris finds himself in a floating form and he hears a voice asking him if he is aware of what is going on. He sees that his body is taken to the hospital and he dies. Chris then goes to his house and his dog barks at him because the animal can see him. That voice then takes form, but it is still blurry and Chris is unable to tell who that is. The voice again tells Chris that he is now dead, but he continues to float around as he sees his wife crying as she looks at the pictures of her kids and mourns her dead husband. Then Chris has a flashback of the time when their dog named Katie was sick, and when they had no hope, they had to put her out of her misery. Marie was, however, very angry because she was unable to understand that by putting her down, they were just showing her mercy. He then goes on to remember how they went to the forest and he ran there with his son named Ian, and there he told them that they will be transferring him to another school. Chris's funeral takes place in a church and his ghost takes form there. He goes and sits in front of Annie, touching her face. Annie of course cannot see him, but she feels something on her face. Chris then goes home and takes a look at the painting Annie had made for their anniversary. The painting depicts the special place where they met for the first time, and this is the place where they plan to retire. He then sees that Annie has started writing a diary as her therapist asked her, but it is not helping her. Chris's ghost grabs her hand and guides her to write, "This is Chris, I still exist." As Annie writes that, it just gives her more pain and she has an anxiety attack. Annie then goes to visit his grave, and as she sits there crying, Chris tries to touch her shoulder in hopes of comforting her. It again backfires and she starts to scream and goes crazy at the thought. Chris understands that his presence is only causing his wife pain. He decides that he is going to let his soul move on now. The next thing we see, he wakes up in heaven, and this place is like the ones in his wife's painting and their special place. He also meets Katie there, who looks healthy now. That mysterious voice again takes form, and it turns out to be Albert Lewis, who used to be Chris's mentor. When he died, he was 63, but here he looks young and healthy. He tells Chris that the world is controlled by his mind, so he can make things move or change by just making a wish and it will work. Chris plays with a bird and then he tries to walk on water, but fails. Albert then tells him that his body is just an extension of his brain, and he eventually manages to walk on water. They then cross the lake and reach a house his wife painted as their dream home. Albert continues to teach him different stuff as he goes on to teach him how he can make this house into whatever he likes. He demonstrates by making a hole in the wall, and through that wall, a beautiful place appears. In the world of the living, on the other hand, Annie makes a painting for her husband's memory, and as she draws a tree, that tree appears in heaven. A young Annie also appears among the flowers. Chris tries to get to her, and as he tries to fly, he falls. Chris manages to come closer to her, but Annie disappears. He is then surprised to see the tree, because he never saw that tree before, and goes on to conclude that Annie is finishing the painting after he died. Albert then tells Chris that he has a very strong connection with his wife because they are soulmates. Both lovers are trying to be together, even if that means death for them. Annie is, however, depressed. Her painting gets ruined, and as she cries looking at the painting, the tree in heaven also gets ruined. Chris, on the other hand, time to time keeps seeing his wife in heaven, but she always disappears when he is about to get to her. Chris then finds his daughter Marie's tiger and recalls the time when she was sick. Chris did not want to go to work that day, and he taught her daughter to play chess. Chris is now confident and thinks that if he has seen Katie in heaven, his kids should also be there, and he is going to see them as well. Albert, however, tells him that he will only be able to see them when he actually means it. Chris wakes up from a nap to find out that Albert is gone, and he has sent Leona to keep Chris company. Leona takes Chris to a city, and there they see a lot of souls enjoying themselves. Annie, on the other hand, feels guilty because she thinks that she is responsible for her husband's death, as she called him that day and he was coming to give her the paintings, and that put him on the road where he died. She also thinks that she is the reason her kids died, thinking that if she was driving them to their school, they would have been alive today. After having fun watching the souls doing their business, Chris goes on a boat ride with Leona and Katie. They start talking, and Chris tells Leona that his kids died years ago, so he is really worried about his wife, who is left alone in the world now. Leona asks him to share a memory of his daughter, and he goes on to tell her about the times he played chess with his daughter. Then he remembers a diorama his daughter had in her room and begins to notice the world around him looks just like that. Leona tells that Chris has now started to get it and goes on to tell him that this is not how she looked when she was alive. She tells him that she chose this appearance because her dad had complimented a flight attendant that looked just like her, and she wanted to grow up and look like that flight attendant. Chris realizes that Leona is actually his daughter, and the two of them go on to hug each other, celebrating that they are together now. In the real world, Annie finds it hard to move on. She is now scared that her therapist is going to send her to a clinic because she already suspects that Annie could hurt herself. She then picks up her diary and writes a letter as she says goodbye to Chris. In heaven, Chris gets back to his house and Albert comes to visit him and brings him the news of his wife's death. Chris is hurt to hear about the passing of his beloved wife, but he realizes that now her suffering is over and they will be reunited soon enough. Much to Chris's dismay, Albert informs him saying that Annie will not be coming here because she committed suicide, and the people who commit suicide go to hell, not heaven. Chris is now furious, and his fury causes a storm in heaven. Chris then talks about the tree and tells Albert that they have a bond and they are meant to be together. He decides that he is going to find her in hell, and since they have a bond, he will be allowed to find her. Albert argues with Chris, but Chris is adamant, and Albert eventually allows him and takes him to see a man who explains further. He tells him that he can find her, but she is not going to be able to recognize who Chris is. They ask him to give it a little thought, but Chris says he is going to go, and the three men get on a boat to cross the seas of hell. They go through a wild storm that shakes their boat. They then run into lost souls who turn the boat over and everyone falls. As Chris drowns in the water, he has another flashback of his wife. He remembers how they argued about Ian and his future because Chris was on the boy and he kept pressuring him to do well at his studies, and it took a toll on the boy. He then recalls how Ian complained to him about being transferred to a new school as he did not want to lose his friends. They finally manage to get to the gateway to hell, and we see a huge desert and a lot of shipwrecks. They start to walk, and Chris cannot stop thinking about Ian, and that is coming in the way of him being able to sense his wife. That day, Ian told his father in the rainy forest that school was hard for him as he was not at all like his father. That day, Chris said to him that he believed in his son, and even if he had to walk through hell, he would not want to have anyone at his side but his son. At the kid's funeral, Chris had given a speech in which he talked about what a man his son would have become if he had grown up. The keywords were brave, respectful, and loyal. Back in hell, Chris sees Albert fighting a group of lost souls. Chris stops him as he calls him Ian. They embrace each other as they reunite, and Chris again tells him that he is the only person he would like to have by his side walking through hell. The other guy then tells Chris that he needs to stop thinking about Ian and start thinking about Annie if he wants to find her. Chris says that he is not going to leave his son behind, and Ian goes on to add that he took the form of Albert because he is the only guy Chris used to listen to in the world. He tells him that he needs to listen now, as he tells Chris that he has to go alone and he cannot be thinking about anyone but his wife. He tells Chris to particularly focus on the time he brought Annie back when their kids died. The tracker tells the elevator to get to hell, and Chris starts to think about his wife. He then recalls how Annie tried hurting herself when the kids died. He had to put her in a mental hospital. Back then, she asked Chris for a divorce as she thought that they were dealing with the situation in their own different ways. Chris and the tracker arrive at a dark and twisted version of Chris and Annie's house. The tracker then reveals himself as the real Albert and warns Chris that if he stays with Annie for more than a few minutes, he may be permanently trapped in hell, advising that all Chris can reasonably expect is an opportunity for a final farewell to Annie. Chris enters their now horrific-looking home to find Annie suffering from amnesia, unable to remember her death and visibly tortured by her decrepit surroundings. Unable to stir her memories, the tracker sees Chris give up on his quest to save Annie from hell, but instead of returning to heaven, Chris chooses to join Annie forever in hell. As he declares to Annie his intent to stay, his words parallel something that he had said to her as he left her in an institution following the children's deaths, and she regains her memories while Chris is making her nightmare his. Annie, wanting to save Chris, ascends to heaven, taking Chris with her. Chris and Annie are reunited with their children in heaven, and all appearances are restored. Chris proposes reincarnation so he and Annie can experience life together again. The film ends with Chris and Annie meeting again as young children in a situation that parallels their first meeting. Thanks for watching. Please like, subscribe, and click the bell icon to get new movie recaps.